The Paternal Metaphor II, 22nd of January 1958. Part 1 of 4. Today we are going to continue our study of what I have called the paternal metaphor. To summarize, we have got to the point where I claimed that it was in this structure, which I have put forward as being the structure of the metaphor, where all the possibilities of clearly articulating the Oedipus complex and its field of action, i.e. the castration complex, can be located. To those who may be shocked that we have begun to articulate such a central question to analytical theory and practice so late on, I reply that it was impossible to do so without first having demonstrated to you over various terrains, as much theoretical as practical, what is insufficient about the formulae that are currently in use in psychoanalysis, and above all else, without having shown you in what way more satisfactory formulae could be given, if I may say so, to begin to articulate the problems, for example, by initially getting you in the habit of thinking in terms of the subject. What is a subject? Is it something that purely and simply merges with the reality in front of you when you say the subject? Or is it rather that, from the moment that you speak of it, this necessarily implies something else? I mean, yes or no, is speech something that floats above her/him like an emanation? Or, if she develops by her himself, if she imposes by her himself a structure such as the one on which I have lengthily commentated, the one to which I have habituated you, and that says that from the moment that there is a speaking subject, there is no question of reducing for her him the question of her his relations to being a question of her him speaking to another, quite simply. There is always a third party. This big other about which we speak, and which is constitutive of the subject's position insofar as he speaks, meaning just as with the subjects that you analyze, this is not simply an additional theoretical requirement. This brings all kinds of advantages with it when it is a question of understanding where the effects that you have to work with are located. I mean, what happens when, with the patient, with the subject, you meet with the demand, the desires, a fantasy which is not the same thing, and equally something that seems, in short, to be the most uncertain, the most difficult to grasp, to define, a reality. We shall have the opportunity to see, at the point we have got to now, to explain how the term of paternal metaphor, it's namely that in what has been constituted as primordial symbolization between infant and mother, it's correctly speaking the substitution with the father as symbol, as signifier in the place of the mother. And we will see what this in the place of means, which constitutes a pivot point, the motor response nerve, if I may say so, the essential feature of the progress constituted by the Oedipus complex. Let's remind ourselves of what it's about. Remember the terms that I put forward to you last year concerning the relationship between the infant and the mother. But also remember to begin with, facing this imaginary triangle that I have taught you how to handle last year in relation to the infant-mother relationship, remember to acknowledge that facing this as the fundamental triangle is infant, father, mother. This shows us something that is real, no doubt, but that already situates in the real I mean as something that is established, a symbolic relationship. The relationship infant, father, mother. And to help you understand it objectively, if I may say so, insofar as we can ourselves make an object of it, observe it. The first reality relationships emerge between the mother and the infant. It's here that the infant is going to experience the first realities of his contact with the living milieu. The triangle, insofar as it has this reality from the single fact that we bring into play, to begin to outline the situation objectively, that we bring into play the father, this father has not yet come onto the scene for the infant. The father, on the other hand, for us, he is real. But let's not forget that for us he is only real insofar as institutions confer on him, I would not even say his role and his function as father, this is not a sociological question, but confer on him his name of the father. I mean that this has to be acknowledged, that the father, for example, is the true agent of procreation, something which is not at all an experiential truth. For at the time when analysts still discussed meaty questions, it happens to have been remarked that in such and such a primitive tribe, procreation was attributed to, I don't know what, a fountain, a stone, or the encounter with a spirit in remote places. To which Mr. Jones had, with much pertinence too, added this remark, that it is completely unthinkable for intelligent beings, and to all human beings we attribute a minimum of intelligence, to be unaware of this experiential truth. It is very clear, unless as an exception, and an exceptional exception, that a woman does not give birth if she has not had coitus, and in a very precise time frame. But in making this remark, which I repeat to you is particularly pertinent, Mr. Ernest Jones simply left everything that is important in the question to one side. For what is important in the question is not whether people know perfectly well that a woman cannot give birth unless she has had coitus, it's whether they authorize with a signifier that the one with whom she has had coitus is the father. For otherwise, the order of the symbol, the signifier, is constituted in its nature in such a way that absolutely nothing obviates, nevertheless, that the something that is responsible for procreation in the symbolic system cannot continue to be maintained as being identical with anything in particular, the things we said earlier, i.e. a stone, a fountain, or the encounter with a spirit in a remote place. The position of the father as symbolic is something that does not depend on the fact that people have more or less recognized the necessity that certain events, as different as a coitus and a giving birth, follow each other. The position of the name of the father as such, qualifying the father as procreator, it is an affair that is situated at the symbolic level, and which can be relayed according to cultural form, for this does not depend on the cultural form, it's a necessity of the signifying chain as such. From the fact that you institute a symbolic order, something answers or not to this function defined by the name of the father, and in the interior of this function, according to each case you put significations that can be different, but which in no case are not dependent on another necessity, which is the necessity of the function of the father taken on by the name of the father in the signifying chain. I think I have already insisted on this enough. Hence, here is what you can call the symbolic triangle, insofar as it is instituted in the real from the moment that there is a signifying chain, that there is the articulation of speech. I say that there is a relationship between this symbolic ternary and the ternary that we brought up last year in the form of the imaginary ternary, which is, for its part, the relationship between the infant and the mother, insofar as the infant finds itself to be dependent on the mother's desire, the first symbolization of the mother as such, and nothing other than this, i.e. that he detaches the effective dependence of his desire from the pure and simple lived experience of this dependence, i.e. that through this symbolization something is instituted, which is subjectivity at a first primitive level. This subjectification simply consists in installing her as this primordial being who can be there or not be there. Hence the desire, his desire, the desire of this being is essential, which means that what the subject desires, it's not simply the craving for her care, for contact with her, or even just for her presence. It is the craving for her desire. In this first symbolization, the infant's desire affirms itself, initiates all the later complications of symbolization in this, that it is the desire for the mother's desire, and that from this fact something opens up by which, in a virtual way, what the mother objectively desires herself, as a being who lives in the world of the symbol, in a world where the symbol is present, in a speaking world, and even if she only lives there wholly partially, if she is herself, as it happens, a being poorly adapted to this world of the symbol, to whom certain elements have been refused, she opens up all the same for the infant, beginning from this primordial symbolization, this dimension, such that, even on the imaginary plane, the mother can, as we say, desire something else on the imaginary plane. It is thus that, in a still confused and completely virtual way, this desire for something else comes in, which I spoke about the other day, but not in a way that is in any way substantial, or such that we could encounter it, as we did in the last seminar, in all its generality, but in a concrete way in which there is the desire for something else, other than to satisfy, for me who is beginning to throb with life, my desire. And through this route, at one and the same time, there is access and there is not access. How can we conceive in some way, in this mirage relationship, through which the being first reads or preempts the satisfaction of his desires in the movements sketched out by the other, in this dual adaptation of the image to the image, which happens in all inter-animal relations, how can we conceive what could be read, as if what is seen in the mirror could be expressed in writing, what it is that the subject desires from the other? Surely it is both difficult to think of and too difficult to accomplish, for it is very much here the whole drama of what happens at the level of orientating the primitive level of what are called perversions. It is difficult to accomplish in the sense that it is done in an incorrect way, but it is done all the same. It is certainly not done without the intervention of a bit more than the symbolization that is sufficient to constitute the primordial symbolization of this mother who comes and goes, who one calls when she is not there, and who, as such, when she is there, one pushes away in order to be able to call her back. There has to be something more. This something more is precisely the existence behind her of this whole symbolic order on which she depends, and which, as it is always more or less there, allows this particular access to this object, her desire, that is already an object so specialized, so marked by the necessity established by the symbolic system, that it is absolutely unthinkable otherwise in its prevalence, and which is called the phallus. This phallus around which I made our whole dialectic of object relations turn last year. Why? Why this privileged object? If not because of something that needs it to be there, in its place, insofar as it is privileged within the symbolic order. It is this that we want to go into in more detail, and in which we are going to see how, not simply by a simple symmetrical relationship, the one that is explained in this diagram and which shows that here phi, the phallus, is at the apex of the imaginary ternary, in the same way that here father is at the apex of the symbolic ternary. How can it be that between the two there is this affair? And how can it be that I can already claim to you that this affair is of a metaphorical order? Ah well, this is exactly what brings us into the interior of the dialectic of the Oedipus complex. It is in the Oedipus complex that we can give ourselves an account of it. I mean, to try to articulate it step by step. And this is what Freud did, and what others have done since him, and it is this that, within it, is still not entirely clear, not entirely clearly symbolized. To try to push things on a bit, not simply to satisfy our own minds, but because, if we articulate this genesis step by step, in which the position of the signifier of the father in the symbol is foundational of the position of the phallus in the imaginary plane, if that demands 1, 2, 3 stages in what one could call the logical phases of the constitution of this phallus as prevalent, privileged object in the imaginary plane, if these phases are clearly distinguished, and if their distinction results in us being able to orientate better, to question better the patient in the examination, the meaning in clinical practice, and the direction of treatment, then this would justify our efforts. And it seems to me that, given the difficulties that we encounter, precisely in clinical practice, in the questioning, in the assessment and through therapeutic work, these efforts are already and beforehand justified.